Welcome, everyone. My name is Marina Antunes, Festival Director for Spark Animation and President of the Vancouver ACM SIGGRAPH chapter. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session in our Meet the Filmmakers series. Very excited to have with us Wei Li, the director of Tehura, whose film was awarded the winner of Best Canadian Film at this year's festival. Hi, Wei.
Hey, Marina. Thanks so much for the introduction and the award.
Well, it's so nice to have you here. And I thought before we talked a little bit about the film, maybe we could get to know you a little bit better.
Sure.
When did you know you wanted to be an animator?
Honestly, pretty much when I decided to make the film, Tehura.
Really?
Yeah, I went to animation school, not so much for animation, but because I wanted to learn how to draw. I was very passionate in comics, and I was like self-publishing my own comics, but I just always felt I lacked the drawing ability because I went to business school. And so I went to animation school just being like, you know what, I'll learn how to draw and go back to comics. But the animation industry was available. You can find work. So I found work. And being in the industry made me feel like I really wanted to make a short film because, working in film and having that passion to make my own stuff meant that I really wanted to create something of my own in this medium. And so I never really thought about, it's not like I had a passion for animating or anything like that. So it was more for the sake of the film that I got into animation. I got into animating. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're a storyteller at heart, clearly.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So, you talk a little bit about having worked in the industry and then deciding that, you wanted to tell your own personal story. Oh, it looks like we have a guest.
Yes. This is Leander.
Oh,
I stole his chair.
Oh, so I'm curious, were you still working while you were making the film, or when you decided to make the film, you thought you would just concentrate only on the film? How did that?
For most of the making of the film, I was working at the same time. I took little bits of time here and there to focus on the film, but mostly I was doing both at the same time, except for the last 5 months of Tehura, where I took those months off to complete the film because I just needed to finish it at that point. Yeah.
Okay, so before we
sorry, that's not true. I planned to take a year off to finish the film, but it was 2020 and things happened, and yeah, I didn't end up taking a whole year, and then I ended up taking 5 months at the end.
Okay, so before we talk about like the production time and what it looked like as you were working and trying to make your film as well, I wanted to ask you about the idea for the project and when you kind of landed on this particular story of Tehura and how that developed, because it is a very unique story and it's really wonderfully told. But I'm not sure, like, I'm curious, when did you, as a storyteller, I'm sure you always have stories that are coming back and forth in your mind. When did you land on this one and decide that this was the one that was going to be your first film?
Yeah, so as you know, Tehura is about a French female dancer, French Polynesian female dancer, which I'm none of those things. Honestly, at first it was just because my friend and I wanted to make a short film, and she suggested the setting in French Polynesia. And I was like, yeah, I love dance. There's dancing in French Polynesia. Let's make a film about a French Polynesian dancer. But the more I looked into it, the more I learned about the culture, but also the history with Orientalism and the objectification of Polynesia, the more I realized that that's what it had to be about if I was to make such a film. At that point, I was still very uncertain. But the only way I could know but I was fascinated enough to want to answer whether or not I should make this film. The only way I could know was to go to Tahiti, which I did in 2016. And I interviewed a bunch of dance chiefs as well as dancers. And it was more because of their such warm embrace that they gave me and support and just unconditional encouragement that convinced me that I needed to make the film. Like everything from the flight attendant on the plane who gave me her contact information, telling me she would put me in touch with a dance teacher, to meeting a art teacher who within 5 minutes invited me to stay with him because he knew the film I was trying to make. And I stayed with him, and we would stay up all night talking about what it meant to be contemporary Tahitian, what does colonialization mean for him, as well as his dance form, and the fact that he understanding my intention behind the film, said, you have to make this film. We don't have a film like this. And honestly, if it wasn't for their support, I don't know if I would have completed the film, because animating is so tedious and so time consuming.
That's also a lot of pressure though, right? As someone that's not from the culture, all of a sudden you have this immense weight of not only telling the story, but telling it authentically and knowing that essentially these people are all watching for the result.
Yeah, for sure. But I think there is a lightness and uplifting quality to their presence and the way that they held me through understanding their dance and their culture. And I don't pretend that I still don't pretend like I understand their dance and their culture. That's not what this is about. And I think, how do I even begin to describe this quality I'm speaking of? The art in their culture, and especially with dance, it's so different from ours in the sense that our sense of art is so individualized. We always talk about the maker, the person responsible, and we always talk about our art. This is, my expression. Whereas there, it is so intrinsically bound to community. And art is just the space where community comes together. And so they kind of welcome me with that attitude. And so I think because of that, it felt like the pressure was more from myself rather than from them, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And it actually ties into, the whole idea of animation, because yes, there are some individuals that create an entire film on their own, but generally speaking, it is a team effort. It's not just one person in a room. Well, sometimes it is, not to say that it's not. But, a lot of the time it is a group effort of a number of people working together to create a great piece of work. So I think that ties in nicely to the whole concept of animation. So, you mentioned you went to Tahiti in 2016. So clearly you'd been thinking about this project for a while. From the time that you actually went and started doing research about, the story, and that started developing a little bit more, how long was that period from when, you went there to, that pre-production before you actually started working on the film intensely?
So how long was the pre-production essentially?
Mm-hmm.
So I actually did another trip in 2019
Okay.
to do all the recordings, like voice acting and recording the sounds of nature, and recording the the music, because I wanted I wanted to be local music. And so pretty much 2016 to 2019, I created an animatic and the designs and reiterated, then brought it back and reiterated some more after showing them, especially the choreography. The choreography had to be done all over again, essentially.
Okay, and I want to ask about the dance in a moment, but okay, so 2019, you make a final trip, you record all of this stuff, and then you start working on the final animation, and you're working full time. So what does that, how long does that take, and what do those days look like for you? Are you working on the film every day? How long? How are you sort of dividing your time? I mean, this sounds like, you know, no life for a year at least.
I mean, I basically spent whatever free time I had that was mentally sustainable. I've stopped keeping track because I found keeping track was too discouraging. And so I just, you know, turned that side off, because you can't question the reasonability of an endeavor at some point if you're really committed, you know. And yeah, so I had a burnout before starting the film, and so that's why it had to be a marathon that was sustainable for me. And so yeah, I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. No, well, it shows a little bit of, you know, you need to know yourself as well, right? It's one thing to want to finish this project, and as you said, you took some time to concentrate on it full time, but you also need to be kind to yourself. You need to know what your limitations are. Talking a little bit about the film and the way it looks, one of the things that's so striking about it is the visual style and the colors and shadows that you utilized, because it's very striking. It's such a beautiful film. Can you talk a little bit about coming up with that visual style, and then the color palette, which is so unique and so bright and vibrant?
Yeah, so starting with the color palette, the entire color palette I'm not responsible for. It's the art director, Ming Newland, who's my best friend, and she's my artist in crime. You know, like we talk about every movie. It takes us like a whole day to watch a movie because we always pause to discuss, and so we really understand how each other think, and we don't really think exactly the same. So we have really great discussion and in-depth discussion. So we're already super in tune by the time she came on board. And she also painted, well, I had initially painted 70% of the backgrounds, but she repainted all of them and finished the rest just to make sure they are extra perfect. Yeah, so all of that credit goes to her in terms of the color palette. In terms of the style, I really wanted, it's probably the final result is probably even a less, not as much as I intended, but I really wanted this huge contrast between the tourist, the Paul's perspective, the male gaze in the beginning, and Tehura's perspective when we switched to her viewpoint. And I wanted the first part to be a lot more, you know, graphic and stylized, in the sense that of like portraying paradise, you know, portraying a world that doesn't really exist, but we want it to exist. So the resorts are built in that type of style. So I was hoping to draw the characters and the line quality to reflect that style. And then for the second part to be a lot more, like you can see the touch of the brush, the rawness that I saw when that I felt when I saw the dancers practicing rather than performing. So that was the main guide for the style, if that answers your question.
It does. And you mentioned at the beginning the music and how you wanted to make sure that the music was authentic and by local artists. And also the other thing that's very striking is the movement, Tehura's movement, especially in that last like sequence. It's just, it's stunning and it's very like it's magnetic and poetic, and it moves on its own, and it's hard to look away from the screen. And you talked a little bit about how you had to redo the entire choreography. And I was curious about, if you could talk about both the music and the movement. And I was curious about how you actually captured movement, if you videotaped, I don't know if mocap was used, but it just feels so authentic. It's so real. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, sure. So I was really lucky to meet a wonderful dancer by the name of Nahima Charles. This was in my first trip, 2016. And we became good friends really fast. And she actually, a lot of the story, as well as the choreography, the narrative of the choreography, which isn't so explicit, but a lot of it is influenced by her life story of growing up with a mother who is very traditional in her Polynesian dance, and then rebelling against that to become very modern with a group that wanted to take Polynesian dance to the world and like make it more almost Broadway-like in a sense, and then going back to her roots of community and all of that. So yeah, her life story influenced a lot. And what happened was, after I learned her life story, I kind of tried to capture what she told me in the form of a poem, essentially. And then I shared a poem with her and asked if it felt true to her. She said yes. And then I asked if it's possible to create a choreography based on this poem that's based on her life. Because part of Polynesian dance, part of Tahitian dance, part of the gestures that they do, it tells a very specific story. And so if you know what each gesture means, you can understand what the story is even more. And so she basically choreographed it once based on the poem. And then I went and I videotaped her doing all of these. And then, but the tricky part is the part where we wanted to use, this is animation, right? So we wanted to make it a bit surreal and we wanted to make it about what's in her mind, not just what you see as an audience member. And so that part was really tricky, of like trying to make it surreal and push it in this medium of animation, but at the same time remaining true to the dance form. And so that's why I had to choreograph it again, is because initially I had this idea of like, maybe we'll bring in some contemporary dancers, because part of her story is that she was drawn to making it more modern, making it more contemporary. So I was like, oh, maybe we can make it a fusion of the dances and then go back to the roots. But it didn't read the way I wanted it. And so I still tried. And so in 2019, I went back and showed it to her, and we agreed we just needed to stick to Tahitian dance. And so that's what I mean by she choreographed it all over again. And so in terms of how, so I would videotape her, and from a few angles, but mostly mainly like full-bodied. And so the videos that I captured don't reflect the camera moves. of the film itself. Those as well as some timing. I try to play with some timing just so that certain parts are more emphasized and other parts are held for longer for emotional expressions. Like those I try to play with as well, but still try to keep it within the parameter that's acceptable in the Tahitian traditional dance. So yeah, that was kind of the process.
That's a lot of moving parts. Was that the
Yeah.
most technically challenging part of the film?
Yes and no. Yes, in terms of like it required a lot of brain power, but it was also so much more engaging and fascinating that it didn't feel long, it didn't feel tedious. But whereas like other parts of the film where you just had to move this character, right? They just have to move. I found those parts way more tedious and challenging just in terms of like sitting there and like, all right, I guess, yeah, I'll finish this tomorrow.
The film has a very powerful message. And I think what's interesting about it is that that message is not, it comes through in the storytelling and not so much in the dialogue. And that's always so important, to use the medium. It is a visual medium, and to tell that story visually. Was it difficult for you to sort of balance the dialogue with being able to tell that story with just like emotional pull and visuals?
It was, yeah. I mean, especially in a short film. And I understand that like in the short film world, in the animated short film world, my film was considered quite long. And like, everyone advises you to keep it short. It has to be under 10 minutes or you're not going to get into the festivals. Like, but at the end of the day, I had to tell the story that I felt. I had to tell it in the length of time that I felt the story needed, right? And I could. There could be more dialogue. I mean, there could be more explaining. There could be more. The story could be 30 minutes, really, and there could be plenty to draw from. And would it be better? Maybe in some ways. I always had the fear that her motivation for doing her last dance isn't clear enough. That's always been like this thing that I'm like, oh, I don't. But at the same time, I feel like not having that certainty is a sign that I'm doing something that I'm not comfortable with, So maybe, yeah. So I don't know. It is what it is.
Sometimes you just have to take chances and
Yeah,
hope that they work. And in
yeah.
this case, it does.
Thank you. Thanks.
You mentioned right at the top that, being an animator was something that you almost kind of fell into. Now that you've done this film and, it's out there in the world, and I know it's just been out there in the world as of recently, but do you plan on telling more stories in this format, in this animated format? Or have you given up? Was this it for you? And you're like, no, I'm going back to comics.
That's pretty much my feeling.
No. You can't deprive us of your talent.
In all honesty, just recently I've felt a bit of craving to, maybe I want to create this short little animation. There is this thing where you play with something long enough that you're like, there are these things that maybe I want to try. What about this aesthetic? So but I do want to tell a longer form story. And in animation, that's just not possible unless you have huge budgets for working with the studio and execs and whatnot. So I am going back to comics, but I have an idea of doing hybrid, like animated panels, but selectively animated panels. I know that there are hybrid animated comics out there, but I think there's some areas that aren't explored that I want to explore.
That's so awesome. Well, we will take whatever you want to give us. Congratulations on Tehura. It's a beautiful film, and it's a wonderfully told story, and I think you did it great justice. So congratulations. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you again, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival.